It's a different puzzle, or I always have a different dress on. I've never worn the same dress twice in 30 years.
For over 4 decades, millions of Americans welcomed them into their living rooms every single evening, convinced they were either secretly madly in love or completely estranged business partners once the studio lights shut down. Behind the synchronized banter, glamorous gowns, and effortless smiles sat a fiercely protected dynamic governed by studio silence, strict personal pacts, and private heartbreak. Now, with Pat Sajak officially retiring his turn at the wheel, Vanna White is finally pulling back the velvet curtain on the real relationship they hid from Hollywood for 41 years. And the truth isn't at all what fans expected. Before the sequined gowns, before the iconic letter turning, and before Pat Sajak became a household name synonymous with American game show royalty, there was a moment in 1982 that almost erased the entire legacy before it even began. And if you think the story of how Pat and Vanna met is some kind of fairy tale Hollywood destiny, you are about to have that idea completely dismantled. Let's rewind to the early 1980s. Merv Griffin, the legendary television producer behind Jeopardy! And the original Wheel of Fortune, was searching for a fresh face to replace Susan Stafford as the show's glamorous co-host. The role was deceptively simple on paper. Walk across the stage, smile at the camera, and turn a letter. But in reality, Merv knew something most people didn't. The chemistry between the host and the letter turner was the invisible heartbeat of the entire program. Get it wrong, and the audience would feel the disconnect immediately. Enter Vanna White. At the time, she was a 25-year-old aspiring model and actress from North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, who had been grinding through the brutal Los Angeles audition circuit with very little to show for it. She'd been rejected more times than she could count. She was living in a cramped apartment, working odd jobs, and surviving on sheer determination. When her agent called to tell her about an open casting call for a game show, Vanna almost didn't go. She later admitted that she nearly blew off the audition entirely because she had another callback for a soap opera that same afternoon. But she showed up, and that decision changed television history. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely surprising. When Vanna walked onto the Culver City soundstage for her screen test, Pat Sajak was already standing at the wheel. Pat had taken over hosting duties from Chuck Woolery just a year earlier, and frankly, the show was still finding its footing. Ratings were modest, critics were lukewarm, and Pat, a former local weatherman from Chicago with a dry, sarcastic sense of humor, was still proving to network executives that he was the right man for the job. So when Vanna stepped out in her audition outfit, the first interaction between the two future icons was, by all accounts, incredibly awkward. Pat later joked that he barely looked at her because he was too busy worrying about his own job security. Vanna, on the other hand, was so nervous that she accidentally turned the wrong letter during her screen test and froze in front of the entire crew. The producers exchanged worried glances. One executive reportedly whispered to Merv Griffin that the pairing felt flat and suggested they keep looking. But Merv saw something the others missed. During a brief break in filming, Pat cracked a self-deprecating joke about his own hosting blunders, and Vanna laughed so genuinely that the entire mood on set shifted. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. And in the hyper-controlled world of network television, that kind of authentic warmth was practically impossible to manufacture. Merv overruled the skeptical executives and hired Vanna on the spot. The soap opera callback? She never went back for it. Within months of Vanna joining the show, Wheel of Fortune began climbing the ratings ladder at a pace that stunned the entire industry. By the mid-1980s, it had become the #1 syndicated program in America, and Pat and Vanna were suddenly the most recognizable duo on television. Fans were obsessed. They dissected every glance, every playful exchange, every subtle touch on the arm during commercial breaks. And that intense public fascination gave birth to a rumor so persistent, so relentless, that it would haunt both of them for the next 40 years. A rumor that would eventually force Pat and Vanna to sit down and make a private pact. One that would govern their entire relationship and keep the tabloids at bay for decades. But the real question is, what exactly happened during those early years behind closed dressing room doors that made that pact so absolutely necessary? By 1986, Wheel of Fortune wasn't just a television show. It was a cultural phenomenon. Over 30 million Americans were tuning in every single night, and the public's obsession with Pat and Vanna had reached a fever pitch that neither of them had ever anticipated. And when you put a charming, quick-witted man and a stunning, radiant woman together on screen 5 nights a week for years on end, the public imagination does exactly what you'd expect. It starts writing its own love story. The tabloids were absolutely ruthless. The National Enquirer, People magazine, Star, every gossip publication in America ran variations of the same breathless headline. Are Pat and Vanna secretly in love? Wheel of Fortune's hidden romance exposed. The truth behind the smiles. Paparazzi began staking out the Culver City studio lot, snapping photos of Pat and Vanna leaving the building at similar times and spinning those mundane moments into front-page scandals. Fans flooded the show's mailroom with thousands of letters begging them to just admit their feelings and get married already. The pressure was suffocating. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Both Pat and Vanna were navigating complicated personal lives at the exact same time the rumors were exploding. Pat was married to his first wife, Cheryl Sajak, and their relationship was already under enormous strain from the demands of sudden fame. Vanna, meanwhile, was deeply involved in a high-profile relationship with Playgirl model John Gibson, a romance that the tabloids were equally eager to dissect. The last thing either of them needed was the world insisting they were carrying on a secret affair with their co-star. So they made a decision, a deliberate, non-negotiable pact that would define their working relationship for the next 4 decades. Vanna has referred to it in interviews as the one rule, though she's been notoriously vague about the specifics. What we do know is this: Pat and Vanna agreed to maintain a strict, professional boundary between their on-screen personas and their private lives. They would not socialize outside of work. They would not discuss their personal relationships with each other in detail. They would not give the tabloids a single shred of ammunition to fuel the romance narrative. On camera, they were America's sweethearts. Off camera, they were colleagues who respected each other's space with military precision. And for the most part, the rule worked brilliantly. It protected their marriages, it protected their sanity, and it protected the show from the kind of behind-the-scenes drama that had destroyed countless other Hollywood partnerships. But rules, no matter how ironclad, are only as strong as the moments that test them. And there was one moment that nearly shattered everything. In the late 1980s, during a particularly grueling stretch of back-to-back tapings, Vanna received devastating personal news that left her emotionally shattered just minutes before the cameras were set to roll. She was visibly distraught in her dressing room, and the production team was panicking because they couldn't delay the taping schedule. Pat, who had been told about the strict boundary they'd established, faced an impossible choice: honor the rule and let Vanna suffer alone, or cross the line they'd both sworn to protect. He chose to cross it, and what happened in that dressing room during those quiet, unrecorded minutes changed the entire foundation of their relationship in a way that neither the tabloids nor the fans could have ever predicted. It wasn't romantic. It was something far deeper and far more complicated. And it planted the seeds of a loyalty between them that would be tested again and again over the coming decades as real-life tragedy began knocking on both of their doors with brutal, relentless force. But the heartbreak that was about to hit Vanna next would make that dressing room moment look like a gentle rehearsal for the storm that was truly coming. If you thought the tabloid pressure was the hardest thing Pat and Vanna had to endure together, you haven't even scratched the surface. Because while the cameras captured their polished smiles and effortless banter night after night, behind the scenes, both of them were walking through some of the darkest chapters of their entire lives. And the most heartbreaking part? They had to do it while the red light on camera 3 was still blinking. Let's go back to June 1986. Vanna White was 29 years old and deeply in love with her fiancé, John Gibson, a strikingly handsome actor and model who had been featured on the cover of Playgirl magazine. By all accounts, they were planning a future together. Vanna was glowing. The show was a massive hit. Life, from the outside, looked absolutely perfect. Then, on a warm summer evening, John boarded a small private plane in New Jersey. The aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. John was just 28 years old. The news hit Vanna like a freight train. She was completely devastated, barely able to function, and the grief was so overwhelming that she seriously considered walking away from Wheel of Fortune entirely. But here's the cruel reality of the television industry. The show had a production schedule that did not stop for heartbreak. Episodes were taped weeks in advance, syndication contracts demanded a relentless output, and the network was not prepared to lose its biggest star during peak ratings season. Vanna was expected back on set almost immediately, and that is where Pat stepped in quietly and without fanfare. He didn't make a public statement. He didn't call a press conference. He simply showed up on set early every morning, made sure Vanna's dressing room was prepared exactly the way she liked it, and gave her the space to cry between takes without asking a single intrusive question. He absorbed the extra hosting duties without complaint, covering for her during moments when the grief would suddenly hit her mid-taping and she needed 30 seconds to compose herself before the cameras rolled again. Vanna later described that period as the moment she realized Pat was not just a coworker. He was family. But the tragedies didn't stop there. Over the next 2 decades, both of them endured a staggering amount of personal pain. Vanna went through a painful divorce from restaurateur George Santopietro in 2002 after 12 years of marriage, a split that was played out mercilessly in the gossip columns. Pat went through his own divorce from Cheryl and later found happiness with his second wife, Leslie Brown, but the emotional toll of those years was significant. And then, in November 2019, the entire Wheel of Fortune family was rocked when Pat suffered a life-threatening cardiac event that required emergency triple bypass surgery. When Vanna got the phone call about Pat's surgery, she was at home preparing for the next day's taping. She immediately dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, sitting by his bedside for hours while the surgeons worked to save his life. For the first time in their entire careers, Vanna had to host the show alone, standing on that stage without Pat at the podium, fighting back tears while turning letters for an audience that had no idea how close they had come to losing him forever. Their bond had survived grief, divorce, medical emergencies, and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. But there was one collision between personal tragedy and professional obligation that pushed their relationship to the absolute breaking point. A moment when the network's demands and their private pain crashed into each other so violently that it nearly ended their partnership for good. And the disagreement that erupted from that crisis would reveal the one recurring fight they had been hiding from the world for over 40 years. Hollywood history is littered with the wreckage of legendary television partnerships. Sonny and Cher disintegrated into bitter divorce and public hostility. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis couldn't stand the sight of each other by the time their partnership collapsed. Even daytime giants like Regis Philbin and Kathy Lee Gifford, despite their deep affection, weathered intense backstage power struggles. In an industry fueled by towering egos, creative jealousy, and relentless pressure, long-term partnerships almost always burn out. Yet for 41 years and more than 8,000 episodes, Pat Sajak and Vanna White walked onto that Culver City soundstage without a single public feud, leaked audio recording, or dressing room screaming match. To industry insiders, it seemed statistically impossible. For decades, gossip columnists and rival producers were convinced that their harmonious relationship was nothing more than a masterclass in corporate public relations. A shiny, lucrative facade maintained strictly to protect a syndication empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But those who worked on the set of Wheel of Fortune knew that the chemistry wasn't fake. It was deeply real, but it wasn't effortless. Spending 12-hour production days under blinding lights, filming 5 to 6 full episodes in a single afternoon, inevitably generates friction. You're dealing with stressed contestants, malfunctioning puzzle boards, demanding network executives, and the sheer mental exhaustion of maintaining high-energy perfection take after take. So how did they survive without destroying each other? Vanna later admitted that their secret wasn't that they never experienced irritation. It was how they handled it. When asked by interviewers if they ever argued, Vanna would often laugh and bring up the famous mustard argument, a legendary, light-hearted debate they once had about whether mustard or mayonnaise belonged on a particular sandwich, which spiraled into a day-long comedic silent treatment. But behind that charming, sanitized anecdote lay a deeper, more complex dynamic. Pat was an improviser by nature, cynical, lightning-fast, and possessing a razor-sharp, sometimes biting sense of humor that loved teasing contestants and testing the boundaries of daytime television. Vanna, on the other hand, was the emotional anchor of the broadcast, warm, endlessly encouraging, and fiercely protective of the contestants' dignity and the show's wholesome legacy. There were days when Pat's unscripted quips or sudden mood shifts caught Vanna off guard. Instead of lashing out or engaging in passive-aggressive bickering on set, they developed a silent communication system. A specific look during commercial breaks, a subtle shift in body language, or a quiet 5-minute conversation behind closed dressing room doors was all it took. They made a solemn promise early on. No matter what happened between them, the crew, the executives, and the studio audience would never see a single crack in their united front. They protected each other from network interference, shielded each other from burnout, and built an impenetrable wall around their partnership. To the executives at Sony Pictures Television, Pat and Vanna were an inseparable package deal, an unbreakable duo that moved in total lockstep. But while their personal relationship remained rock solid, a silent, corrosive issue was slowly simmering behind executive doors. An issue that had nothing to do with creative differences or personality clashes, and everything to do with power, respect, and cold, hard cash. Because while Pat and Vanna stood side by side on television screens across the globe as equal halves of an American institution, the financial reality behind the scenes told a radically different and shocking story. A staggering disparity that went unchallenged for nearly 2 decades, until Pat announced his retirement and forced Vanna into the biggest fight of her entire career. For decades, Wheel of Fortune presented one of the most balanced illusions in television history. Pat spun the wheel and delivered the jokes. Vanna revealed the letters and illuminated the stage. In the minds of millions of viewers, they were equal co-architects of a multi-billion-dollar syndication empire. But inside the high-stakes boardroom meetings at Sony Pictures Television, the balance of power looked shockingly different. When the financial numbers finally leaked into the public sphere, the entertainment industry was genuinely stunned. Pat Sajak was pulling in an estimated $15 million a year for his hosting duties. Vanna White, on the other hand, was earning roughly $3 million annually. Now, $3 million is undeniably a fortune to any regular working person. But here is the jaw-dropping reality that made headlines around the world. Vanna White had not received a single raise on her base salary in nearly 18 years. Think about that for a moment. For nearly 2 decades, as inflation surged, as the show generated astronomical syndication profits, and as Vanna became one of the most recognizable, beloved pop culture figures on the planet, her compensation remained entirely stagnant. When the show transitioned to computerized touchscreens in 1997, critics sneered that her job was becoming obsolete. Yet research continually showed that Vanna was the emotional magnet of the franchise. Audiences didn't just tune in to solve word puzzles. They tuned in to see what Vanna was wearing, to bask in her radiant warmth, and to feel the comfort of her familiar presence. For years, Vanna quietly accepted the disparity, choosing workplace peace and gratitude over public corporate warfare. She loved her job, she cherished the crew, and she refused to rock the boat. But in June 2023, everything changed in an instant. Pat Sajak sent shockwaves through the television landscape by publicly announcing that the upcoming 41st season would be his absolute last. He was stepping down from the host podium and walking away from the wheel for good. Suddenly, the corporate executives at Sony were staring down a massive crisis. Losing Pat was a colossal risk to the show's syndication dominance. But losing Pat and Vanna at the exact same time? That would be a catastrophic death blow to the entire franchise. Vanna knew that for the first time in her 40-year career, the leverage was entirely in her hands. She retained high-profile Hollywood powerhouse attorney Brian Friedman to handle her negotiations. Friedman went on the offensive, openly calling out the glaring gender pay gap and making it crystal clear that Vanna would not return to stand beside a new host unless her immense historical contribution to the show was financially recognized and respected. As the negotiations dragged on through tense, high-stakes summer months, tabloid headlines began churning out dramatic narratives of backstage betrayal. Rumors spread that Vanna was furious with Pat for amassing a fortune 5 times larger than hers, and that the financial tension had finally shattered their legendary 40-year bond. The public held its breath, waiting to see if their iconic friendship would implode under the weight of Hollywood corporate greed. But what the tabloids didn't see was what was happening away from the executive bargaining table. Pat didn't undermine Vanna. He didn't defend the executive pay structure, nor did he distance himself from her fight. Instead, Behind closed executive doors, Pat made it known that Vanna was irreplaceable. He quietly backed her right to fight for what she deserved, validating to studio leadership that the show could not survive its upcoming transition without her steady, iconic presence. Armed with unmatched public support and her unshakable legacy, Vanna successfully closed a lucrative new deal, securing a substantial pay raise and extending her contract through the 2025 to 2026 season. The battle was won, the corporate tension subsided, and the franchise was saved. Yet the resolution of the business contract only cleared the way for an emotional reckoning neither of them was truly ready for. Because with the corporate ink finally dry, the calendar began racing toward Pat's final day on set. And when the studio cameras powered down for the very last time in June 2024, the goodbye that unfolded behind the scenes shattered 41 years of carefully rehearsed television routine. Stage 11 at Sony Picture Studios in Culver City had witnessed thousands of tapings over the decades. But on that warm afternoon in June 2024, the atmosphere inside the building felt impossibly heavy. Everyone present, from the veteran lighting grips and camera operators to the senior network executives standing silently in the back, knew they were about to witness the closing chapter of a pop culture institution. It was episode 8010, Pat Sajak's final day at the wheel. For weeks leading up to the finale, the media had been buzzing with retrospectives and career highlights. But nothing prepared viewers for the raw, unscripted emotion that punctured the broadcast the night before Pat's final episode. Instead of the standard closing chat at the host podium, the show cut away to a pre-recorded, deeply personal video tribute from Vanna. Standing alone on an empty soundstage, looking directly into the camera lens, Vanna let her signature polished composure fall completely away, as decades of archival footage flashed across the screen, capturing their big-haired 1980s debuts, goofy holiday specials, and thousands of shared laughs. Her voice began to shake. "I don't know how to put into words what these past 41 years have meant to me," she confessed through visible tears. "You made me who I am. You are like a brother to me. You're a true friend, and I love you." For Pat, a broadcaster celebrated for his razor-sharp wit, cool detachment, and refusal to indulge in Hollywood melodrama, watching Vanna's tribute proved almost unbearable. When the broadcast returned to the live set, his trademark smirk was gone. His eyes were glassy, his jaw clenched as he fought back the kind of tears he had spent 4 decades avoiding on national television. For 41 years, Pat had been the unflappable anchor of the evening. But in that single broadcast segment, the reality of what they were leaving behind hit him with overwhelming force. When the final puzzle of Pat's last episode was solved and the familiar credits rolled, the Culver City soundstage erupted into a deafening, sustained standing ovation. Crew members who had worked alongside Pat for over 30 years stood openly weeping behind their monitors. There was no giant confetti drop and no flashy Hollywood stunt. It was simple, deeply dignified, and devastatingly final. Pat gave a gentle wave, offered a quiet thank you to the millions of families who had welcomed him into their living rooms every night, and the floor director called out the final rap, "And we're clear." Yet the most powerful moment of that historic day never made it to television screens. It occurred only after the studio monitors went dark and the crowd began filtering out into the California sunshine. For 41 years, Pat and Vanna had followed an almost mechanical post-taping ritual. A quick laugh about a contestant's bizarre guess, a brief nod of mutual respect, and a walk back to their dressing rooms. But as they walked down the backstage hallway of Stage 11 together for the very last time as co-hosts, Pat suddenly stopped just before the dressing room corridor. Away from the network brass, the producers, and the buzzing crew, the famously guarded host dropped his defenses entirely. He turned around and pulled Vanna into a long, silent embrace. And right there, in the dim backstage quiet, Pat whispered words of gratitude and emotional vulnerability that Vanna had never heard him speak in over 4 decades of working side by side. A private admission of just how much her presence had anchored his own life and sanity through the chaotic storm of fame. It was the ultimate, poignant conclusion to the longest-running duo in television history. But as the backstage doors closed behind Pat Sajak for good, a chilling new reality immediately set in. Because in just a few short weeks, the studio lights would power back up. the wheel would begin to spin again, and Vanna White would have to step onto that stage without Pat standing across from her. And the private conversations that followed would reveal whether Wheel of Fortune could ever truly feel the same again. When the Culver City soundstage reopened its doors in the late summer of 2024 for season 42, the energy on set was unrecognizable. The iconic puzzle board had received a high-tech modern refresh, the studio lighting felt sharper, and standing behind the host podium was Ryan Seacrest, a television titan with decades of live broadcast experience, yet fundamentally an outsider entering sacred territory. For Vanna White, stepping out onto that stage for the very first taping without Pat Sajak was a disorienting, out-of-body experience. For 41 years, essentially her entire adult life, her stage instincts had been tethered to one man. She knew precisely when Pat was about to deliver a dry punchline, how to read the subtle tilt of his head when a puzzle went off the rails, and exactly how many seconds of banter they had before the commercial music began to swell. Suddenly, the muscle memory of 4 decades had to be completely rewritten. Looking across the gleaming studio floor and locking eyes with Ryan instead of Pat felt like stepping into an alternate reality. Yet Ryan, fully aware of the monumental shoes he was attempting to fill, made a crucial decision from day one. He didn't try to replicate Pat's sarcastic, world-weary charisma, nor did he try to dominate the stage. Instead, he treated Vanna with the immense deference she had earned, openly acknowledging in interviews and on set that Wheel of Fortune was her house, and he was simply a grateful guest. Overnight, Vanna became the undisputed emotional matriarch and steady anchor of the entire franchise, the living bridge connecting the show's legendary past to its uncertain future. Audiences tuned in by the millions to see if the show could survive such a seismic transition. And while Ryan brought a fresh, polished enthusiasm to the broadcast, fans quickly noticed something heartwarming. Vanna hadn't lost an ounce of her magic. If anything, her presence felt more essential, more cherished, and more powerful than ever before. Away from the blinding studio spotlights and television cameras, the bond between Pat and Vanna didn't fade into Hollywood history. In fact, freed from the relentless grind of production schedules and corporate network politics, their dynamic shifted into something even purer. Pat settled comfortably into well-deserved retirement, spending time with his family, attending theater productions, and occasionally tuning in from his living room to watch the very show he had shepherded for half a century. And despite 40 years of rumors suggesting they were secretly estranged outside of work, their private communication remained unbroken. Regular text messages, shared laughs over ridiculous social media headlines, and quiet dinners away from the paparazzi continued just as they always had. When Vanna is asked today about the real truth behind her and Pat's relationship, there is no lingering mystery, no hidden scandal, and no bitter Hollywood tell-all waiting to be written. The truth she finally laid bare is something far rarer in the entertainment industry. An unbreakable, 41-year partnership built on unconditional loyalty, deep mutual respect, and a profound, platonic love that weathered every storm Hollywood could throw at them. They didn't let romance ruin their working chemistry. They didn't let corporate greed destroy their friendship. And they never allowed executive pressure to fracture their united front. As she continues to illuminate the puzzle board night after night, Vanna carries forward a legacy that will likely never be matched in television history. And while the wheel keeps spinning and new champions are crowned, the quiet promise Pat and Vanna made to each other on that dim Culver City soundstage remains entirely unbroken. No matter where life takes them, no matter who stands at the wheel, what they built together belongs only to them. After 41 years of rumors, shared heartbreaks, and unmatched Hollywood loyalty, Vanna White has finally laid bare the reality of her life with Pat Sajak, except for one final, private agreement made during their very last walk off the stage, a secret that explains why their bond could never be duplicated by anyone else.